All right, hello again. So in this video, we are going to create a couple of typical layouts. One's pretty typical, one's a little bit more fancy, that you'd see on the web, but we're going to do them using CSS Grid. We also have in these some CSS or some fallbacks that use floats. So at the time of this video, CSS Grid is fairly new, and even if it wasn't, some people are going to have older browsers that aren't going to necessarily understand CSS Grid, so it's good to have some fallback. So fallback is code that's there in case your newer sort of features of CSS or other things don't work. So that's what we've got going here. So let's look at the structure first of the page so you know what's happening here. So if I go down to the bottom, there's a wrapper typically around everything. So there's the wrapper. Here's the header at the top. Here's the sidebar 1, which is over here on the side. Here's an article for our main content. Here is the second sidebar, so it's a 3-column layout, and then there's a footer underneath. Very typical, right? So let's see how it's set up right now. The page is actually working already right now with 3 columns because there's floats in here already. So floats, again, are kind of old school, and hopefully they're going away, but they're still around, right? And browsers have understood them for a long, long time, so they should work pretty much most of the time. So yeah, almost all the time. So we've got the sidebar here, a style for the sidebar, which has a float of left and a width of 15. We've got the content, which is the center area again. It's floated left and has a width of 70. And then we have sidebar 2, which is floated left and has a width of 15. So let's see, 15 and 70 is 15. That's 100 if my second grade math is right. Yes, I think it is. And then we've got the wrapper centered here, so it's kind of all centered. And that's about all we have. We also have media queries in here. So again, media queries means these styles below inside this media query, which starts here and ends down here, I think. These media queries are in effect above 500 pixels because it says min width of 500. So if I resize this right below 500, it's just stacks like it would be good as a mobile layout. And then if I go wider again, it turns into columns, which is kind of typical responsive behavior. So this is a responsive kind of design too. Basic one, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and turn this into a modern layout using CSS grids. Okay, so I'm going to go up near the top, and I've got some comments in here to help with you and help me find this stuff. So we're going to create a grid container and put space between it. You may have seen some of this code already in other videos, depending on what order you're watching these in. So you may see some things again, but that can only help, right? To help remember stuff. So I'm going to go up and say display grid right here. So I'll just say display and grid. That turns it into a grid container, and now all of the items are grid items. So it's kind of messed up right now, but we are going to fix this as we go along. So I want to add a little space between each of these using grid gap. So there's already a space, but that's some of the existing code, and we're going to use grid gap, which goes along with grid to specify how much space there is between those items. So we said display grid, which turned it into a grid container, the wrapper. We're styling the wrapper here. And then we gave it a grid gap of 10, which is the space between the items at the end here. All right. So I think we're good with that. So let's go down to here. So we have the wrapper selector again. So now we're going to say how wide we want our columns. And I have a little note in there. You can use many different units here. We're going to use the FR unit, which I'll explain to you in a second. So I'm going to go down here about line 56, somewhere in there, but you'll see it better on your version. And we're going to say grid template columns, and then I'm going to say 1 FR, 3 FR, and 1 FR. So what we're doing is we're telling the browser that we want 3 columns, and if you think of the FR unit, it's kind of like a fraction of the free space. What does that mean? We're kind of dividing this thing into units of 5, and the first column is going to be 1 unit wide, the second one's going to be 3, and the third is going to be 1. So this is all messed up right now because the widths are still in effect that we set earlier. So it does look pretty messed up at this point. By the way, we're on the first file. You should get 2 files with this video. that says 3 columns using line numbers. So we're going to use line numbers on this one to specify how wide things are. So that's what we're doing next. We're also going to leave off the rows on this one. On the second one, I think we'll put in rows. But we're letting the content kind of determine how high the rows are, so we're not worried about that. But you could specify the height of the columns or the rows. But we're going to do that on the next one. So we're not worried about it on this one. All right, so I'm going down here where it says header and footer. So we obviously want the header and the footer to not be these little strips of weirdness. We want them to go all the way across like they were in before we messed it up with our CSS grid. So what we're going to do is go down. It says make the header and footer go all the way across. So how do we do that? We're going to say grid column, which is shorthand. Well, let me put it in here first. I've got grid column. I'm going to put 1 and then a slash and then a -1. And it's fixed. So what did we say? We said grid column 1 / -1. This is the same. Grid column is a shorthand for these two properties, grid column start and grid column end. So basically when you say grid column start, you're saying, where do I want this object to start? I want it to start at grid line 1. Where do I want it to end? I want it to start at grid line -1. What the heck is -1? Let's look. So here we've got, this is from CSS Tricks, probably still there, hopefully. This is showing a little schematic of how the line numbers work. So when you're talking about columns, they're numbered, and you can reverse this direction too if you want to use other languages, which is another CSS setting, but we're going left to right and top to bottom, so in English anyway, and on this web page. So here's line 1, here's line 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So they are the lines between these, which are called your grid tracks. So your grid tracks are where your content is, and the grid lines are between them. It's kind of like a table, like the old school tables, but a little different methodology. So we've got 1 through 6 in this example on our grid lines, but you can also number with negative numbers, and you kind of go backwards along the opposite direction along the same axis. So what I mean by that is grid line 1 is also grid line -6. Grid line 6 is also -1. So -1 is a cool thing to remember because it's always going to be the last grid line. So instead of you counting them up, or you probably already know, but it helps to sketch these things out. But instead of counting them up, you can just use -1, and that's always down here on the end. Pretty cool, huh? So we're saying we want let's go back to this. We want our column, or our header and our footer, to start at grid line 1, which is on the left, and we want it to end on -1, which is on the right, in our case. So now they go all the way across. Those are fixed. Sweet. All right. So I think that is good. The only other thing we have to do is we have to fix the widths here. So this is still acting like it's trying to fit in here with 15% of this space, I think. There's doing some weird things in there. So we need to fix that. I'm going to roll down to down here where it says we need to set the widths used on floated items back to auto, and remove the bottom margin as when we have the grid, we have gaps. So what's going on is we want to set the widths that we set widths up here, remember, or you didn't, I did, I guess. We have widths up here that are still in effect, so we want to reset those. So we're going to use, which you may have seen this code already. Again, like I said, some of this is you may have seen in a different video. I'm going to say @supports, and this is a CSS feature query. So the feature query means, again, I'm testing if something, we're testing if something is understood by the browser. If it is, then we want something to happen. So we're going to put that condition in the parentheses here. We're going to say display grid. What that means is, and then we're going to put our curly braces, just like in a regular feature query or a media query. So this means we want these styles between this brace and this brace to work if the browser supports, thus the supports display grid. This browser does, so when we do this, it should work. We're going to say .wrapper, which is our wrapper thing again. And then we're going to do the child selector and then the universal selector. And we're going to say width auto. And that fixed our widths already, look. You probably didn't see that, but it fixed our widths because now they're all set automatically instead of by the grid, instead of by the 15%, 30% stuff we had earlier. And then we're going to set margin 0 to override some of our margin weirdness that we had in there too. That's it. So this little piece of CSS means, does the browser support display grid? Yes. Then if it does, do this. This selects everything, the asterisk means everything, that is a direct child of the wrapper. And that is, by the way, how the CSS grid works, is when you set a grid container, which is our wrapper, everything one level down, everything becomes a grid item and goes into the grid. Not more than one level down. So this means only select one level down, right? Because it's the child selector. That means one level down that means not something inside of something else won't become a grid item. Only one level down. That's how it works. So hopefully that made some sense, but I think we're good. And now we've got a nice layout using CSS Grid. But if the browser did not understand it, again, if it's an old browser, it's a geriatric browser. No, that sounds bad. It's an old browser. If it's an old browser, it will use the floats that we had up here anyway. So what happens is the browser, if it doesn't understand the CSS Grid stuff, it ignores it and uses this stuff. All right, I think that's good. So let's go to our second one, which is only slightly more complicated, but not too much. So I'm gonna open up my sidebar and go to number 2 here and close that up. So this one you can see is a little more interesting or difficult maybe, but it's still working and it's still got floats in it. So this one's got a 3 columns, or it's 3 columns, but then it goes to 2 columns. So we've got the same thing we had before. We've got a header and a footer. We've got a sidebar on the left and the right, and we got our content area. But then we have another 2 containers below that that are set 50% width. So these are still 15, 70, and 15, and these 2 are 50. They are still done right now with floats again. So if I go down there and look, here's sidebar, content, and sidebar 2. Those have the same settings as the previous example. And then we have story 2 and story 3, which are set at 50%. Thus we have that. And yeah, so that other than that, it's pretty much the same. Of course, it has those 2 extra containers down here at the bottom. Here's the story 2 and here's story 3. But this time, instead of using line numbers, we're going to use line names. So it's another way to, you probably heard this before, but there's kind of a million ways to do these things in CSS Grid. And it's meant to be flexible and let you do things the way you want to do it, but it does make it a little more complicated because there's a million ways to do things. But this time we're going to use line names instead of, well, we're going to use a mix of things. You'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so now we're going to go down and do the same thing we did before. We're going to turn this into a not a flex container, a grid container. So we're going to say display grid again. It should be around line 32 again. Hopefully it's similar for you. I'm going to say display grid. And we get the similar thing that we got last time, right? Now everything is in a grid, but it's kind of messed up because of some width and some other styles, which we'll fix. We're going to add the same grid gap again. Probably could have left this part out and done it for you, but I was feeling cranky today. No, I wasn't. You need to do it too. All right, so we've got display grid and grid gap, and that turns this into a grid container and sets the space between them to 10 pixels, which is what we had before on the previous one. Okay, so now we're going to go down to about line 60 something. Here we go. This is where we're going to use slightly different code than we had on the previous one. We're still going to go grid template columns, and this is going to be a little bit tricky. So I'm just going to put this in, and then I'll talk about it because it's hard to type it and talk at the same time. So I can't do stuff like that. 200 pixels, and then 1 FR, and then 1 FR. And then in square braces, I'm going to say middle. What does this mean? I'll explain it in the middle. I'll explain it in a minute. And then 1 FR, 1 FR again, and then 200 pixels, and then square brace and end. What is all that mess? You're asking me and yourself. So if we think about it the way we looked at, let me make this wider so it makes it a little more visual here. If we think about it the way we did it last time we said we had 3 columns, right? So we said 1 FR, 3 FR, and 1 FR. That's 3 columns. Since here I have 6 values, there's 1, 2, 3, 200, 1 FR, and 1 FR, and then 1 FR, 1 FR, and 200. Now we've got 6 columns. So we're setting up 6 columns for our grid. But what is this stuff in the square brackets? What is that? Those are the line names. So when you want to name the lines in your CSS grid, you put them in the square brackets. So we named the first line. Let me go back to my illustration. So this is from the same CSS tricks again. If I go down, here is how you can name lines. So you put them in square brackets, and then you can give any line you want a name, whatever you want, pretty much. So here is first. Here's line 3. This one says column 4 start. You can name it whatever you want. This one says end. So that's kind of what we're doing. We're naming these lines. The lines, by the way, can also have more than one name. You could use the number. You could use the name. It's a little strange. One line can have multiple names. You can give it as many as you want. I don't know why you would do that, but it might come up sometime in the future. We're going to give it one name. So we're giving the first line, our left side, a name of start. Makes sense, right? And we're giving the last line at the end, end. That makes sense too. And then we're giving the one in the middle a name of middle. Also makes sense. So if you think about it this way, it just shows you line and then track, line, track, line, track. If you leave it out, it doesn't have a name, really. It still has a number, but it doesn't have a name. So the first line, and here's our first track, second track, third track. Here's the middle line, fourth track, fifth track, sixth track, and then the line at the end on the right side of the last track. Kind of like we just saw right here, right? Here's the line name, and there's the track. Here's the line name, here's the track. Here's the line, there's a track. So the tracks and lines alternate. Okay, so we created 6 tracks and then 3 lines down the left and right side and down the middle that have names. And we're going to use those in a second. I said on this one we're going to give the template, the rows, some height too. So we're going to say grid, right below that, I'm going to put grid template rows. And this time we're going to say 300 pixels, auto, and 100 pixels. So you can probably figure out that this, our grid that we just made has 4 rows. We have one that's 100 pixels at the top. Actually, let's do 300 in there. Let's put, let's do 300 pixels at the top. Then it's got one that's an auto size, which means the content kind of determines it, right? And then one that's auto, and then the one at the bottom is 100. So this is going to be our header row, and this is going to be our footer row. Let me get this out of the way so you can see what's going on here. If I look what's going on now, this one is actually the right height, and this is the right height, but this is all messed up. What's going on here? That's because we still have some widths and floats and things going on, because we haven't specified where those things should go, so we're going to do that now. But the heights are right on those rows. All right, so here we're going to go down again, and this is what we had last time as well. It says dot header and then comma dot footer. That means we're going to style both the header and the footer. We want them to go all the way across. Last time we said 1 and -1, which meant the left line and the last line. But since we named these lines start and end up here, we can use those instead. Okay, so what I'm going to do is say grid column, the shorthand, and then I'm going to say start without the braces this time, so it's just the word start, and then a slash, and then end. Aha! Look, it worked. So now, we're still a little bit too wide here. The header and the footer both go all the way across because we said we wanted the header and the footer to start at the start line, which is here, and end on the end line, which is out here. So one good thing about naming these instead of using numbers, -1 would always work, but for the end. But if I name the lines, if I decided to go in and add more columns in here, like say I put in 1 FR, I probably shouldn't. I'll do it anyway. If I put in another column, the number of columns has changed. So if I had 6 here, 6 would be wrong. It would be 7 or 8 or whatever. So the number changes because I added a column, right? But the line doesn't change because I named that line end, if that makes sense. I'm gonna take that out. Make sure you take that out. I was just trying to show you something. We still have 6. There's 6 right there. So names can have a little bit of advantage because they don't change You don't change the name, you don't change the line, it stays the same, if that makes sense. It can be moved over. You don't have to count. Let's put it that way. You don't have to count. You can just name them. All right. So now we've got to fix all these guys. So I have this code in here for you already with styles for the 5 main containers, the content sidebar, 2 sidebars, and 2 stories, right? So all we have to do now is specify where we want those boxes to end. So we're going to do this a couple different ways just to show you the different ways you can do it. So the first one, we'll use our line numbers again like we did on the first example. I'm going to say grid column. And I'm going to say 2 and 6. That means we're starting, the content is starting on grid line 2. And it's still kind of messed up because we don't have everything in here. And then it ends on number 6. It'll work at the end, I think. We'll see. Sidebar 1, we wanted that over here, right? So I'm going to copy and paste this, even though that's risky, but we're going to do it right here. We're going to say grid column for the sidebar. We want the sidebar, the left sidebar over here, to start at the start line, right? Remember we named it start, so we're going to say start. There it is. It starts on the start line. And we want it to end on, actually, this time we're going to use span. I didn't talk about span yet. Let's use span 1. Span is yet another way to say how big the track is. So span 1 means basically the track is 1 grid line wide, or 1 column wide. Let's say 1 column wide. So it's spanning 1 column. So that's another thing you can do. You can use span. So we've got 3 ways now. We've got numbers, we've got names, or we can use spans. How wide is it? It's kind of like the old row span and column span in tables, which used to be used a lot for layout, but not anymore, right? Bad news. Okay, sidebar 2. We're almost done here. Sidebar 2. I'm going to paste in there as well. Sidebar 2, we want it to start at grid line 6, which is over here. And then where do we want it to end? We want it to end on the end line. So I'm just going to use the end line. I don't have to remember which number it is. I could use -1, but I wanted to show you how you could use the name. So now it ends on the end line, hopefully. We'll see if this works at the end, and then we'll make corrections if we made a mistake here. Story 2, I'm going to say story 2. So we want that one to start at the start. Remember we said the left line is start. And we want it to end in the middle. The middle is the line that we named in the middle of our layout. So it goes halfway across. Then on story 3, we want it to start in the middle. So we put middle here. And we want it to end on the end line, which is the last one. Okay. Then I think that's it. So the only thing we're missing, hopefully, is our same code that will reset the width. So right now the widths are all still in effect, and that's messing up our layout. Most of it anyway. Some of it's okay. Some of it's not. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to be lazy because you guys have done this at least once, maybe more. And I'm going to go back to number 1. The first one we just did a minute ago. And I'm going to copy and paste that. So I'm going to get that display grid supports thing. And go back to file number 2, which is our new layout. And I've got the same space in there for it. I'm just going to paste it. It's around line 109, but it's below this comment tag here. I'm going to paste that. And boom, I think we are good. Let's see if that worked. It did work. Sweet. So here's our 300 pixel high, 300 pixel high header that goes all the way across. Here's our sidebar. Here's our center column. Here's our right column. There's our story 2 and story 3. So sidebar 1 is ending here. This one is spanning how many columns? We made 6 columns, so this is spanning 4 columns. We didn't say span 4. We just said to start on a certain number and end on a certain number, and we get this flexible center. So right now it's kind of the most flexible column, and it kind of breaks. This design breaks a little bit. I mean, that's too narrow, right? And I could change my media queries or do some different styles, but you get the idea that the center column is kind of changing a lot as we resize this. But once we get down to 500 pixels, it goes to a single column. I could change it to 700 and then probably work a little better. But you might add more media queries and more changes. But I just wanted to get you to see that we've got this responsive sort of grid here that kind of makes some decisions for itself as far as like how big things need to be, and you don't have to worry about, you know, calculating percentages of widths and stuff like that. The browser does it for you. Make the computer do it. That's what we made them for until they take us over, right? So I think that is it for a couple of basic layouts using CSS Grid with float fallbacks, and I will talk to you again next time.